So welcome to this webinar on strategic and operational planning. This is our third webinar in the governance series. I'm Spencer Brigham, the Training and Events Administrator for AFOA Canada. And just before we begin, I want to do a short land acknowledgement. So welcome everyone and thank you for being here. I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the First Nations. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors of our society. We honor the traditional lands and homelands of Indigenous peoples and communities across Canada, including First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, living both on and off reserve in rural and urban communities. And just a bit about myself, I am Ojibwe from Walpole Island First Nation in Ontario, also known as Pequedronong. And so without any further ado, I'll hand it over to Harold Tarbell.
Thank you, Spencer. Hello, everyone, and welcome to AFOA Canada's Strategic and Operational Planning webinar. My name is Harold Tarbell. I'm a Mohawk from the community of Akwesasne. My Mohawk name is Sagum Kueonta, which means he helps them to their place, or he sits them in their place, which the clan mothers and faith keepers have given me in respect of my my life and my career as the meetings helper, and particularly as a facilitator and a chair. The other thing I've done quite a bit throughout my career is strategic planning, and have particularly worked with AFOA Canada around the idea of strategic planning, having been involved in supporting them both since about 2006. Currently involved in helping them revisit their strategic plan. Have delivered their more involved community workshops on strategic planning. I also helped to develop their initial curriculum around the process for comprehensive community planning and to do some delivery in that area as well. And I've done strategic planning with a whole host of organizations and communities, both local, regional, national, and United States and Canada as well. I do want to begin by, as Spencer has done, also acknowledging the AFOA Canada's location in the ancestral and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, and pay my respects to them and to their territory. I want to acknowledge the Squamish Nation, whose territory here in North Vancouver I've had the great privilege to live and work over the last few decades, and of course to acknowledge my own home community of Akwesasne, between Ottawa and Montreal there on the St. Lawrence River, in New York, Ontario, and Quebec, and of course the territories, traditional and community through which you join us today. So really appreciate that. This one of our webinar, we are going to focus a little bit on the planning, what planning is, the planning process, particularly around strategic and operational planning itself. And we've got about an hour. I'll work through the material that we've got here. I am paying as much attention as I can to the chat function, so please feel free to bring your questions there. I'll build those in. And if we have time at the end of the hour, we'll also open up look to the chat and open up the floor for more questions if we could. All right, Spencer, let's get the PowerPoint up on the screen, and let's work our way through that. Thank you. In terms of the next slide, I've talked again, looking at the introduction to planning, and then talking a little bit different planning, the process overall, but kind of some specific stuff with an emphasis primarily on the strategic plan, comprehensive community plans a little bit, and then the varieties of operational plans that we do see following that. So that those three strategic, operational, and comprehensive community plans are reflected on our next slide. And these are the three, which sort of are the core. Let's keep moving forward. There we go. Again, these are the three kind of key slides when you look at it, starting at the bottom. Comprehensive community planning, long-term, 20, 25 years, very holistic in terms of looking at, What are we going to do in housing? What are we going to do in health? What are we going to do in governance? What are we going to do about culture and language? What are we going to do about safety? What are we going to do about land development? What are we going to do about environment? So very comprehensive, but also fairly high level. You know, it will sometimes you'll see in the comprehensive community plans they'll have a little bit of a starter thing, but it's pretty comprehensive but pretty high level. Strategic plans at the top of this slide. When we did the comprehensive community plan, one of our leaders from the Gitsan had been involved in the way he described comprehensive community plans. He says it's the strategic plan of all of our strategic plans. He says because we have a strategic plan in each of those areas that I've just mentioned, and including treaty negotiations. And when we look at the comprehensive community plan, it sort of says the reason we're doing all these things is to achieve all of those things in the CCP. So it's kind of nice to see that reaction. Operational plans are really short term, 1 year. If you get into the project operational, then they can be even shorter. But essentially, it's about how are these larger plans going to be brought to reality and put in place? How are they going to be implemented? And operational plans and the variety that are there will do that. One of the things when you get into these operational plans, that's where you start getting into more detail, like comprehensive community plans, strategic plans, operational plans are essentially increasing layers of detail. You're starting to dig in a little bit more as you go. You know, of course, there's a host of other plans as well, and I'm sure many of you are experienced with that, with that range. Just to think of a few of them, and some of them are, a lot of them are, you would consider them operational plans. So there is the emergency preparedness plan, there is the land use plan, there is the financial management plan, there is the risk management plan, there is the investment plan or the debt service, which could be tied to your financial. So there's a whole, the list goes on and on. And so just, again, you're just trying to find that ecosystem of plans. And my friend over Jessie Hemphill has this great slide where she kind of has a slide which calls it the ecosystem and shows the connection and the variety of them that we are dealing with in our communities and as First Nations government and Indigenous communities and organizations. The other thing I would say here is that it's important to think about the planning cycle. And so whether you're doing any of these plans, or even if you're just looking at problem solving, it is a fairly consistent cycle that you need to go through. And without getting into the technical details of that, essentially there's an idea or there's an issue and you need to deal with it. And so you need to do the necessary research, that you need to be informed and to be really clear what aspect of that issue you are dealing with. Then you do some additional research and then you think about, well, what are my options? Right? What are my strategies? What are my outcomes? What are my approaches? So there's a range of options and you want to make sure you're looking at essentially coming up with a lot in the beginning and then winnowing it down to the chosen ones in terms of what you're actually going to do and what you're actually going to focus on. Then there's a decision-making point where you get to, where you in fact, somewhere, some shape and form, a decision has to be made about what's in the plan and what's not in the plan, and about some way of formally adopting that plan, making the decision about how you're going to proceed. Then implementing it, getting into the operational piece of it, getting into the tasks, getting into the strategic initiatives, getting into the work planning piece of it. And then, of course, the other part of that cycle then is to pay attention to what's happening, to see what the effect of your decision and your plan is, and then to assess and to be looking for continuous improvement, and then to modify and revisit as you go through that cycle, and you repeat the cycle. And then when you're looking at these operational plans, you're repeating that cycle on a yearly basis. When you're thinking of strategic plans, you're touching base on occasionally over the year, but every 3 to 5 years, you really want to dig back in and redo that whole cycle. And comprehensive community plans, essentially 10-year cycles is probably not a bad place to go, because you can see some real concrete improvements there. I'm dealing with one group now, and I think it's been 15 years, and they've just redone their comprehensive community plan. So, again, that cycle and the recurrence of that cycle varies depending on your level of planning, but that I think is kind of critical to keep in mind. So let's go to the next slide, and then let's dig in a little bit. So in this one, well, this says, what is strategy? I think really when you look at those 4 bullet points there, what is a strategic plan? And, a strategic plan, this is what's in it, right? The vision for the future, the plan of action, the strategies you're going to pursue, and this is what it does. It guides your work. It says, here's where we're going to focus. Here's what we're going to look at. We're trying to deal with a bunch of other stuff, but this stuff we're going to focus on as well. And here's how we're going to collaborate between our governance, our government, our governance, our administration, our programs, our other entities in our communities as well. And some of the component parts: vision, mission, values, priorities, and some level of scoping it out. In a strategic plan, I recommend staying at the goals and objectives level, but most they come in all shapes and sizes, by the way. But most do start to get down to some level of specificity. Just a word on strategy. So strategy really then talks about the choices you're making to sort of get to the issue. So if I've got to deal with my governance stuff, if I'm going to deal with my housing stuff, if I'm going to deal with my environmental sustainability stuff, I've got to have some strategies. And depending on the style of strategic planning you use, you can have core strategies in there, which everybody then is informed by and feeds into. And sometimes that's where you have. And then you can also get into what I would call program objectives, almost, where you could have housing strategies, because you might need to do things slightly different versus what you might do in water and infrastructure, for example. So anyway, that's let's say a subtle distinction between a strategic plan, which contains strategies, and a strategy itself. And by the way, one of my lessons learned over the years is in the process, don't try to quibble too much about the terminology. My experience has been we quibble about it, we never agree on it, we don't come up with any strategies or priorities or goals or objectives or tasks or initiatives or activities. And so just overall, there has to be sort of a linear, logical sequence from the large vision down to the smallest task you might put in your strategic plan. And when you work your way through, if you deliver on that, it takes you to the next level, gets you to your objectives, gets you to your goals, contributes to your mission, moves you closer to the vision that you've set out. So there's a bit of a linear piece to that, but there's also an intuitive piece. And I'll show you something at the end of this session which kind of puts it in a nice way and boils it all down and kind of shows you the nimbleness you need to have in order to sort of make a strategic plan really, I think, really effective and well crafted. So, so strategy, a strategic plan, but there's a strategic planning process too, and we'll see that on the next slide. Strategic planning. So here's the nice definition. Formal planning process, I like to refer to as a management tool and a leadership tool, which allows an organization to be proactive in changing it, and I would say responding to its environment and pursuing priorities with a purpose. So that's kind of what you're trying to get at there. And then it's long range. So really what it does, it asks you to look up from the work we're doing, and we got a lot of responsibilities and a lot of deliverables and a lot of pressures. So we could be working 24/7. I know all of us, but in a way, strategic planning asks you to take a step back, to take a breath, to look up, and to really think about, okay, am I just busy or am I getting somewhere? So am I focused on the right things, strategic? Am I doing things right, operational? So that's kind of what we're trying to get to here. 3 to 5 years is a pretty good place because you're putting some pretty big ticket items in here. And so, you want to give yourself some time to create the change and get to the results that you're looking for. And then a part of that process, right, that I talk about, there's a place where it needs to be formally approved. And that is one big outcome of a strategic planning process, a strategic plan. Early in my career, I saw many strategic planning retreat reports. And a strategic planning retreat is important, but it is only a part of the planning process. There is a thing called rapid strategic planning where that could be all you do, and there's a legitimate way to do that, but it's a part of the process. And in the end, you have to translate that conversation into a strategic plan. And there's, like I said, multiple models. I'm going to show you something from the Grove strategic visioning process. There's great material out there about strategic planning in nonprofit organizations. There's a little bit about strategic planning in a government organization, because that's an interesting piece as well. And then, there's a host of things about strategic planning in a business and economic environment as well. I guess one thing I would observe about strategic plans is it's people go both ways on it, but some organizations, councils and organizations like to have one strategic plan, but it is perfectly fine to have multiple strategic plans. Balanced Scorecard talks about it as cascading strategic plans into an organization, into the levels of an organization. And what I've observed is that generally for us, it's the council strategic plan, which is the guiding document, and let's say the most authoritative. But when you're looking at the program administration, you could have a band office strategic plan, as well as a health strategic plan and a housing strategic plan and an environmental strategic plan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The key is when each of those has a vision and mission and values and priorities, you can see some differentiation there. And then even when you look at the strategies, the important thing is that they don't conflict. And so what you're really looking to do, in my view, is to ensure that there's some sort of alignment and coordination. And it can go in a variety of different ways. And so oftentimes what I see happening, and I am working in a process on safety plans, where we will look at the comprehensive community plan to see what it says about safety. We will look at the council's strategic plan to see what it says about safety. And sometimes it's massive, and sometimes it's almost invisible. But what we will do is then we will look at if there is vision statements and mission statements and value statements, rather than creating different ones, which is fine as well, we will look at what they are, what those agreed community-wide ones are, and we will say, well, then what's the work of community safety, and how does it align, and what does that vision, what does that mission, what do those values or principles mean for community safety, and then try to use the same ones, but then describe it in that context. And so that's another way of sort of keeping that alignment and in coordination. And I do think that is really critical when you do look at that. Again, at the end, as I mentioned, let's go to the next slide. At the end, as I mentioned, you do need to have a plan. So make sure that it gets shaped and that you winnow out the strategies and the focus and the priorities from that conversation and from that research that you're going to do. And essentially the process, I don't think we touch on it here, but it is, yeah, we do a little later, so I'll come back to that. So here's an example. So again, the idea of, what's our goal here? Improve housing. And, what are the strategies? So you're trying to assess the needs. In terms of our standard programming, you could see how then you would collaborate to go and pursue the implementation of that and do that. I think the other thing you try to do in strategic planning is get away from the either or. So is it a CMHC house? It's either a CMHC house or it's an Indigenous Services Canada house. And I think you got to get away, important to get away from either or thinking in strategic planning, and you got to take some time to try to come up with some creative options. And so here I would say it's important that they then look at the variety of their housing stock and the different kinds of needs in terms of shaping that strategy. So there could be a new homes need, but you could also see that in the strategy, there's going to be a renovation and a retrofit need. I think the other thing is when you look across the entire housing continuum of the various forms of housing, types of housing, both from whether it's a rental housing or home ownership or, let's say the design of housing, is it multiplex, is it single family home, is it single level homes, is it basement homes, are we including outbuildings, garages and porches and other components to it. Like, there's quite a bit of variation, and so you do want to get there workforce planning as well. We can talk about that a little bit later. So even in these plans, you do got to get to that resource allocation, and workforce availability is a part of that. So human resource availability is a part of it. Workforce strategic planning could also suggest you're looking at what's our long-term growth of our workforce and how do we build the capacity of our people to meet those current and future needs. Could be a piece of that kind of work. I did have a fortunate in my long career of having spent some time working with what are currently the Indigenous Skills and Employment Training Groups, formerly Assets, way back when it was called the Pathways Program, and we did regional and national bilateral agreements, and there's a variety of ways we've talked about that program over the generations. I just want to make sure. Yeah. My other note here is, if you don't have any important choices to make, do you really need a strategic plan? Or if your housing is in such crisis, or you as a council and a community are dealing with so many crises, that's not a time for strategic planning. That's not a time for policy making either. So really, really be careful about that. And so often when you're looking, going through that process of a strategic plan, you got to look at the issues, you got to analyze them, and we will come up to issues. Are there long-term strategic fundamental core issues we've got to deal with? Are there operational issues which will either be linked to at some level to our strategic plan, or which are just the operations responsibility and we don't need to address them in our strategic plan? Or are they crisis issues that we've got to deal with, and we don't have the luxury of creating a strategic plan? You might have a strategy for dealing with it, but you don't have the luxury of this more involved process when you're dealing with all of those. All right, let's shift our focus a little bit and talk about the operational planning, which I think is our next slide. Yeah, so in many ways, operational planning is, and I would call it operational plans in a sense, because there are various levels to it. So how do you've got a comprehensive community plan, you've got a strategy, hopefully they are aligned, but you can pick and choose from there in some respects. But what do you do? How do you take that and operationalize it in a yearly planning, budgeting, delivery, reporting, accountability, evaluation cycle? How do you deliver in that concrete space of time? Operationally, well, here's another thing. In Balanced Scorecard, which is one model I've been dealing with lately, they often talk about 4 perspectives in there, which you'll see many strategic plans will touch on. But you can then see how there is a strong connection to the work that you do operationally. And so Balanced Scorecard talks, it says, you always got to think about your customers, your client, or in our case, the people, our members. You always got to be thinking about your finances, your financial management, your financial stewardship, your financial sustainability, your financial stability. You got to be looking at that, and so you can see how that plays out in the operational side. You got to always look at your internal business processes. So what's our policies, procedures? What's our business lines? How do we do our work here? What's our business processes look like as a collective and within each of our departments? And so you can see how you could then operationalize that way. And then the fourth perspective is organizational growth and learning. So where is my organization growing? How am I making sure I have the capacity to address these things and be prepared for the results that are going to come from my comprehensive community plan and my strategic plan? It could be professional development. It could be, could be traditional inclusion. Again, a lot of different ways to look at organizational growth and learning. But then again, how you're going to do that will often be operationalized. In some sense, the strategic plan should help you make choices, help you narrow the field, sort of give you a defined ballpark to work in, where you would then have some latitude on the operational side about the actual how-to of it. That is a funny, fuzzy line between strategic planning and operational plans, and most of the clients that I've worked with don't like just staying at the goal and objective language. They really like to get into it. The trickiest one is I had one band CEO say, give me examples in here, which what he really meant was, we have some project priorities. Let's make sure we put those in there. So that's all. That's a bit of a tension point in the planning process. So you just got to be alert to that. What I always say is, understand the models that you're using and the theoretical basis for them, then adapt them to your client and your needs. Don't shoehorn the client into a model just because it's one you're comfortable with. Really do that sort of analysis and crosswalk to do. And as a facilitator, strategic planner, I give myself permission to, as long as I think I understand the theoretical basis of the model of strategic planning that's being provided, I mix and match as much as I can to address certain issues and certain needs and certain strategies in the process itself. So again, I talked about these a little bit earlier in the brief discussion of that. Performance indicators. So just a little word on that. Generally, we brainstorm, and generally they're more project management or contract deliverable indicators. Did we do what we say we were going to do? Did we spend the money the way we said we were going to spend it? Do we create the products that we said we were going to do? So activities and outputs. So more at that level, which is what you're going to get to in an operational plan. But the other thing about performance indicators or key performance indicators or performance measurement is that is also its own specialty. And so there's quite a bit of work that can be done around there. There's a lot of good experts available for that. And we don't do a lot of that in there. There's one group that I'm very fond of. It's called the Performance Measurement Blueprint, and emerges out of Australia. There is a person here in Canada who does some training around that. But really what it says is, we also want to be looking, again, this is more on the strategic side, we want to be looking at results and measurable results. And so are we creating the change we want? So if you're familiar with logic models, are we getting more to those intermediate and long-term outcomes rather than those program delivery pieces? And so trying to get to that, are we getting closer to the vision, so to speak? And that's a nice process. I highly recommend it. They do a performance measurement report that I've never seen in my entire career. And I was in a mixed group with them of 25 people from around the country, government, corporate, resource industries, private sector, not-for-profit, social groups, political groups. Not a single one of them had seen a performance measurement report like that, which actually allows you to make midstream adjustments based on evidence. So anyway, it's an interesting piece. But the point being, the stuff we're doing now is good because it is helping us, and we are again meeting our business deliverable processes and responding to the needs and the direction we see in our strategic and operational plans. But there is we could up our game on that side, as I guess my observation. Why is operational planning important? Yeah, so I think the line I've seen sometimes is a vision without a plan is a delusion. And so in some respects, it's all great stuff, but if you don't have an operational plan and you don't know how you're going to deploy your resources and you don't know how that's going to fit into that cycle I keep referring to, then it's very easy just to be busy. Very easy. And, be busy, 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 busy. And at the end, can't really say if we've achieved what's in that strategic plan. So just to be aware of that. But it does help us to implement, and it does provide a focal point and let's say a level of awareness for the players around that. And often, as we're looking at that planning cycle I talk about, we each have different roles, right? So council will have a role, senior management has a role, frontline staff have a role, our communities have a role. And the important point I like to make about that is that as you go through that cycle of planning, budgeting, delivery, reporting, assessment, and accountability, and then renewal and modification, everyone needs to stay involved in that process and has different roles to play. Because if you only wait till the very end, your ability to influence is undermined a little bit. So you want to be careful about that. You'll see here there's some checkpoints as well. Let's look at the next slide if we could real quick. Yeah, so again, more specificity there. The key point here, there's some approval process. I mentioned make sure that it does get approved. And there's also at the operational level, that's where you're really going to then say, here's how we're connecting the resources to it. Sometimes at a strategic level, we don't often see the financial analysis, particularly in the indigenous communities in our strategic plans. Sometimes that's people are very proprietary about that and don't like to talk about that. But that is a big factor in terms of what you're able to do in terms of, let's say, being realistic in that. And so, yeah, again, I think the other one, a plan without a budget, is also a delusion. It's a phrase that I've heard in training, in the work that we've done as well. So I think a key thing here, which is something to think about from strategic planning and operational planning, is sometimes we tend to add on and pile on without saying, okay, this is what we're not going to do. And this is how we're going to change what we're going to do. And so that's something you got to be really conscientious about as well. Comprehensive community planning is next. So again, just a brief blurb. I've talked a little bit about that already. So let's look at that next slide. And we talked about that pretty much. This last bit's about the planning process. I think we're going to be pressed for time. So again, here's, if you go to the next slide. So again, looking at, there are different layers where it is. So the strategic planning and the focus and the responsibility, the transfer, and then the operationalization. So again, you can see how there are many potential operational plans. Depends on the organization. You might have a business plan, which covers the whole thing. You might have an annual operation plan where it's all pulled together, or in many cases, we have a series of plans which are pulled together and which the band manager then uses without necessarily consolidating them into a mid-level operational plan as well. So let's look at the roles and responsibilities. We talk about that in some of the other webinars and some of the other work AFOA Canada does. But just looking at the process, we've kind of broken up the process on the next slide in terms of pre-planning. So getting ready to plan. So when you look at those stages of a strategic planning process or plan, there is some getting ready and there's a lot of analysis that you can do. So, and then, creating the structure and the process that you're going to be using. And you can learn a lot already about the context that you're working in, what's there, and already start to be framing what could be happening. There's an argument to be made, and sometimes it's necessary where you don't have to wait for the retreat and with a blank slate. Sometimes that's a good thing, and sometimes you don't have the latitude or luxury to do that. But you can arrive with some, giving them some piece of information on that, particularly if the board is busy or the council is busy, or if there's a pre-existing plan which you can then build on. So there's some stuff you can do. You just got to be really careful about the engagement piece so that you're not arriving and this looks like you've done all the work and they just go, that looks great, let's do that. Like, you want to avoid that. You do want to engage them. You do want to sort of encourage that sort of critical thinking. They'll do some analysis, but sometimes the analysis is what we'll often do and what Madeline Dion Stout likes to refer to as the splendid isolation of draft of writing, in terms of just trying to pull that together, shape it, move the pieces around the board so that you do have both a thing which I would say unravels the complexity, demonstrates that there's alignment and coordination, and enables you over the course of time to become increasingly strategic in your management and in your thinking. And oftentimes this happens over a number of cycles of strategic planning because people come at them at different times and places in their career and in their experience. Implementation. So we've talked about that transition into the operational piece. So that's a big part of that. And it could be even detailed in terms of what the agenda looks like, how you structure the cycle of the focus of the council in the seasons, in our fiscal seasons, if you want to think of it that way, and then sort of that wrapping up that planning cycle that I've talked about there. All right, let's move to the next one. This one talks about the planning steps inside of a strategic plan. Get ready to plan, analyze the environment. So SWOT is mentioned, context mapping is another one, but what are the environmental trends, good and bad? What's the strengths and weaknesses internal of the organization and at present? The people is an interesting one because let's say from a band council and a band administration point of view, the people would be outside, there would be an external one, but in the Indigenous community, it's very hard to think of them like that. The other thing I would say is that, again, in terms of the discussion and all that kind of stuff, I wouldn't quibble about that, whether that's internal, external. It really comes down to the analysis you'll do in the writing in terms of where you'll anchor that. And so just not to get caught up in that dynamic, but that does happen. Review or create vision mission. Often what will come out of that environment scanning and that visioning mission stuff is you'll start to see what the issues are, the tension points, the focal points. I call them the emerging critical issues. And oftentimes, let's say where people want to go and what they want to do, and those bundles of activity that we need to focus on, that emerges in the hustle and bustle of the work you're going to do beforehand, what you're going to get from the conversation. So a lot of that will come out, and that'll help you to shape and offer recommendations around those priorities. Goals and objectives. So yes, there could be multiple goals to achieve my better housing, improved housing. I could have a number of goals. And like I said, goals could be related to new housing, goals could be related to renovations, goals could be related to new land, like, expanding opportunities. Like, there's a different ways you could define those goals and those objectives. We have a thing that talks about it a little bit later, but a nice way to look at it is what's my foundational piece? What's my middle building ground? What's the bigger steps that I can get to over the course of a few years? And so a lot of good ways of looking at that. And we've mentioned these other pieces as well. Let's keep going. Are we, Spencer, let me just check on time.
Yep. So we have 20 minutes left in the scheduled time.
Oh, thank you very much. I had it in my head we were at the 15 mark, so I'll take a breath and carry on.
Okay.
All right. So let's go to the next slide. Oh, let's see. Yeah, pre-planning. Well, so these next slides tend to kind of dig in a little bit in terms of what we were looking for, the prepare to plan. So who's going to do it? There's much you can look at, and there's trying to almost set out your planning process and planning project management plan. And then, there's lots of information readily available that you could start analyzing. One trick I like to, I guess, but one drafting thing I like to do is a lot of times we have information that's out there that's kind of hard to grapple with, or we've looked at it so many times, communities looked at it so many times, that we've kind of stopped reading it. So what I like to do in a strategic plan is I like to try to reshape that and give it a new look. Sometimes that's just graphic design, but other times it's trying to, tweeze out different ways of looking at those issues or restating, certain current context, because it gives it a fresh look. And what I'm trying to do is, from the reader's point of view, I'm trying to encourage a creative look at things so that they can start thinking about things differently. So I'm trying to move that creative thinking forward. So that's kind of what you're trying to get at that. So, much is already known, and then you can, start looking at drafting, in familiar territory. Again, it's preparing to plan. You can start doing some analysis for efficiency's sake, but it also helps you to then keep that conversation moving forward. And while you try to allow a lot of latitude in those conversations and in that retreat part that comes up, it's not the only place where the analysis gets done. All right, always have a core group. In change management, we talk about having a core group. So change management says have a shared vision, put together a guiding coalition. And in some respect, when we talk about the committee, which you see on the next slide, for the planning team, then that's really what you're looking at. Who's the guiding coalition that's going to allow you to do this? And what you'll notice about this is that, again, you want people who can bring you some information to help you be really responsive to the needs of your community. You have some leadership who are, really can help you do that visioning and look forward piece, and have a good sense of where they want to go. And then you have the administration, of course, who bring the expertise to that. You can always bring in additional expertise, whether it's, your handy dandy facilitator, or if you're getting into a technical detail like land use planning, you may need somebody on that to provide some context, whether that's in the process, at the retreat, in the drafting. All right, so the piece about the community, so there is, and you see this a lot in strategic planning, and you do see a lot in, especially in comprehensive community planning. They really emphasize the engagement piece. And that's really where the strength of a comprehensive community plan comes from, in the sense that you've had this sense that you can say, this is the people's voice here. This is what the people's will is. I have an example where they did a comprehensive community plan, and one of the issues they identified was too many people were running for council. So they have a massive amount of people running for council, and people were getting in with just the smallest amount of votes and largely unprepared for the job. And so what they did is because of that was in the comprehensive community plan, they created a requirement that there had to be one, you had to take a orientation. Once nominated, you had to take an orientation. And if you didn't take the orientation, you weren't on the ballot. And that was approved by the community. And so again, when there's a lot of pushback from the candidates, they basically were able to say, it's the people's will, and it's what they told us to do. We have their permission to do that, so that it didn't become, Harold, you're telling me I can't run? What kind of a dictator are you? So, it was that kind of a dynamic. And it did do two things. It reduced the number of people, so it increased, in a way, the democratic support that every member of the council did have, so it was a much more broader base. And the second is they arrived a bit more prepared to succeed, if you want to look at it that way. So, all right, so that's an important mechanism. Let's look on the engagement, which is the next slide. There we go. Yeah, the basic pieces, right? What do we have? here's the frame that's emerging. Here's what our processes are going to look like. Here's where you get it. We're really looking for some, to have a kick at the can. And in many ways, when you look at that vision, mission, priority, that's pretty much the whole bundle of the work. I don't know if you'd really get into you'd get into the situation where you'd have them in the drafting. Your committee might be in the drafting. You might go back and forth on different stages of that. So it's not just necessarily a one-off thing. There's probably a communications and marketing strategy that, sort of is a companion piece to that. I do believe this webinar will be available for future viewing, and I'll leave that with AFOA to respond to that note in the chat. Vision statements, which is, so then we're getting into the concrete pieces that are there. This is another area where two things, sometimes people look at this as a bit of a throwaway. It's a little too airy-fairy. I do see a lot of times where these are come in all shapes and sizes, like strategic plans. I think the most unique strategic plan I ever saw was it was on 3 business cards stuck together. It was the Calgary YMCA, I think, did a strategic plan, and that was their marketing tool. They boil it down to that. Vision, the longest vision I've ever seen is 3 pages. The Aboriginal Healing Foundation, their vision was 3 pages. But essentially, what are we trying to do there? We went back a slide there, or did somebody ask to go back a slide? I'm on the vision statement slide. But essentially on the vision statement slide, what's the vision trying to do? There are some detailed definitions, and there's almost like formula definitions that you can use to start crafting it. Does it state your purpose? Does it identify, in some ways, the problem in a resolved state that you've been focusing on? And in a way, I like to describe it as a picture of the future that you're going to create. And the other thing I would say about that is that it's not some magic future generation that's going to create that vision. It's us. And so that's sort of the strength of a vision statement. A challenge in the process of a vision statement is because it's early in the process, everybody fights to have their word in there. And so sometimes, and it doesn't recognize that there'll be other places in a strategic plan where they may fit better. So there's some politics of visioning. There's a couple of techniques we like to use. Which I call is getting drafting fodder into it. I generally try not to do. I try to nail down the vision statement in the retreat. I'd like to get as close as I can, but I've been in situations where I've been. That's all we talked about, and we never confirmed it. So, again, thinking about the fact that you've got a drafting process and a check-in process and an approval process where that can continue to get shaped. So and you can always go back to the community on that. So here's one: sustaining our inherent rights, facing challenges together, and building a strong and healthy community. So it does talk to some of their purpose, right? It's about rights. It's about working together. It's about a strong and a healthy future. It's kind of what we want to be as a people and a community and as a nation. So it is there. I see the word "to" wording. I don't know if that refers to me or to that, but in terms of this one, I have seen strategic plans which are down almost like to that logo line, or to the one-liner. We have one here in the First Nations Health Authority: healthy, prosperous, vibrant First Nations individual families, communities, and nations. So something like that piece. So again, I think you do got to be flexible in terms of what works for the group. I try not to be too dogmatic about what goes in there. I did one strategic plan where they didn't want any strategic priorities or core priorities. So it was an interesting drafting a piece on that. So again, you got to adapt to your clientele and what they need. And in this case, if Louise was my boss on this project, well, then she'd have her vote might mean a lot in the conversation about how, as a facilitator or a drafter, I might address that. Mission statement. really it's cascading down from the vision, but it's in a way it's why we've come together as an organization, which is again to deal with that vision statement, what we do as an organization, and the focus we're going to do relative to address, achieving the vision statement itself. Somewhat, when you look at that, what you're doing, how you're going to do it, and why. But at very high levels, sometimes I like to think of it as what's our business line. We're in rights assertion. We are in service delivery. We are in health and the quality of life. Like these are some of the, broad, big ticket business lines. When you think of all of our programs, what are the things that they're doing? And that's the kind of things I like to see in a mission. By the way, people will quibble about, what goes first, which one's bigger, which one's component part of that. Again, I try to avoid the quibbling. Again, respond to what they need, and then shape it. But essentially, what you're trying to get at is, in big picture terms, what's the change we're trying to create? And in big picture terms, what's the promise we make to each other about how we're going to work together and how we're going to do that work? And so that's kind of what you're trying to find, that summation or the motivating phrasing that's going to help you do that. And it becomes a big piece of the marketing. Again, the simple, the easy to remember, that's pretty valuable. It's powerful if you can do that. But again, for strategic purposes, it's whatever helps the group become strategic and start pursuing that path. That's really what we're after. So just in terms of thinking of the connection, look at these two here. So if the council is focused on rights and quality of life, and what else do they have in there? Similar to this, sustaining our inherent rights, facing challenges together to build a strong and healthy future. So our mission is to provide consistent quality services that will enhance the quality of life for all the, Akwesasne, it's Akwesasne, which is my community, while protecting our rights, preserving our resources for the next 7 generations. I'm trying to remember if I had a role in this. I did do strategic planning for both my American Tribal Council and my Canadian Band Council. The Canadian one I did in 2006, 2009, and I'm happy to say they've been continuing that process. And each council renews the strategic plan. And my tribe, we did our first one ever in 2019, I think, is when we did it. One thing about that, I remember I emphasized the importance of creating a strategic plan. 2 quick stories on that. In Akwesasne, I asked them for the strategic plan, and they said they had done one in 2006, and they had done on the American side, and done one in like 1999. Everybody said they had done it. No, to this day, I have not seen that one. And I know they're there somewhere, but again, they were produced, but nobody ever saw them. Another example, I work with one community, and everybody checked, and their planning process, they have to check the box. Have you compared your program operational goals to our strategic plan? And everybody clicks the box. And so I'm doing the process. No one could give me the strategic plan. And so the way I looked at that is, as well, I'm sure they said, well, they gave some thought to being strategic, and am I being strategic and that kind of stuff. So yeah, I can check that box. But anyway, so that's the other part of, we'll get to the monitoring piece, just making sure that that system you put in place is followed. Because again, that whole idea continues to unravel the complexity, helps you to continue to be more effective at aligning and coordination, and then really entrenches you into that strategic management, strategic thinking approach to things. All right, let's look quickly at the environmental scanning, assessing the current situation. Yeah, we didn't talk about values here. Like there's often a value statement. The one point I'll make about it is values and principles are slightly different, but it's a distinction without a difference in some ways, because really what you're looking at is, does it guide our behavior? And in terms of the plans, you want to make sure that you're seeing it in the writing, but you're also seeing it in how it's implemented so that those values actually mean something. And, again, guide our behavior. Current situation, so again, that's an analysis, lots to do there. I've mentioned about how to pull, how that analysis and what you see there really starts to give the signals you need to do in order to shape your strategic plan. This one here, it could be quite costly in terms of the time of effort that goes into it. So there is a thing called rapid strategic planning, which is, really quick. And the retreat is everything in that component. But again, if you're doing a more structured process with a committee, with some pre-work, with some engagement, with some analysis, then some drafting or mixing and matching it as you go, this assessing the current situation. So it's not just describing it. You got to be looking at these pieces as so what. So yes, I pull all this information together. This is everything that we've been doing. This is what we got right now. So what? What does that mean for me? What does that tell me to do? And some of it is linear, logical analysis. Some of it's intuition. And so there is that part of the process where it can get a little bit murky. All right. Setting priorities. I do like this next slide in the sense that it gives you a nice way of looking at it in terms of some criteria for what's a high priority, what's a medium priority, what's a low priority. Focus on 3 to 7 strategies. Absolutely. You get past 7. I like to stick in the, 5-ish range if I could. Because and often what happens if you get more than that, you're starting to get into different kinds of plans. But also it's easier, you can remember 5 strategies. I'm improving my governance. I'm, enhancing, delivering excellence. I'm, building a community of professionals, if I could steal one of AFOA Canada's lines. Like, so they're the bundles of activities that you need to find, and you can find that. But here's some nice ways of looking at that. Sometimes it's a simple matter of voting. In the process, sometimes there's, the council has its clear ideas about what priorities we should be pursuing. Sometimes there's a reality check on available resources and deliverables, and how much space we have in our resources and deliverables to actually do some of this other stuff. So that it's not just a wish list. All right, steps to take. This next one. Yeah, so we're now starting to get into, the definitions and the distinctions. There are some great definitions, almost like drafting formulas out there. SMART, which we mentioned a lot, is quite used a lot, but think of it as a drafting guide to structuring those, and you can apply it to both goals and objectives. Essentially, what you're trying to get at is relative to a priority. It would, there are several goals you could take, and I've laid out a few in the housing context. Relative to those goals, there's a number of objectives, whether they're short, medium, and long term, or whether they're component parts, which have to have objectives, different ways of crafting that. But it is a linear piece, right? The vision guides the mission, guides the priorities, guides the goals, guides the objectives, guides the initiatives and tasks, guides the implementation, guides the monitoring. And then when you come back, that, it should linearly lead you back to that. So every little thing you do should either be informed by or contribute to what you see in your strategic plan. The next one is a work plan. We're starting to get into some fairly detailed places, and this is a fuzzy line on this next slide, essentially in terms of the separation and how much detail you need to put in a strategic plan. Balanced scorecard, the one I mentioned, basically says strategic initiatives, targets for what you're going to achieve, measure how you're going to measure whether you've got there, goal objectives based upon those 4 categories of clients, finances, business processes, and organizational growth and learning. That should feed and help you achieve your strategic results, which are guided by your strategic priorities. That feeds your mission, that feeds your values, and all of it's done consistent, or your vision, mission and vision, and all of that's done consistent with your values. Just scanning through here, we'll show you those slides. But you recycle, monitor, keep looking at it, incorporate it, entrench it as much as you can. Don't let it sit there. Even if it does sit there, it can be a valuable tool for you. I did one group with a meeting with a group. They hadn't really revisited it, but they'd done a lot of what was in there. So the process of developing it is as important as the product that comes out of it. Let's go to the next one. I talked about modifications, and I think I just have the last slide in our last minute, which is an add-on slide. This comes from the Grove International in San Francisco, and it just kind of sums up that, look to our history, do some analysis, engage in the development of these pieces, implement that, cycle back, keep going through that. And I do love the fact that, look to the past, learn from the past, plan for the future, operate in the present. So that I kind of like just a nice way of doing that, and the use, of course, of the infinity diagram. Kind of nice. But anyway, that's a useful tool. It's available. It's a nice descriptor. And I arguably I could have done this whole workshop just talking about that slide. If you want to think of all the pieces that we've done, they're all kind of noted in there somewhere. All right, everybody, we are at 11:31. I think we are at the time that we're done. So thank you very much. And I'll turn you back to Spencer.
Yep, so we are officially done with this webinar. Did you want to answer maybe like 1 or 2 questions?
If they're willing to stay, I'm sure. You got
Okay,
some for
so
me?
if anybody has any questions, we can go through just short answers to 1 or 2 here. Or if not, that's fine too. There was a lot of information, and it also takes a while to process. So,
yeah, basically we'll call it any free strategic planning advice you want.
Yeah, and you will all be, I've seen several questions, you'll all be provided with a cloud recording of this, so you'll receive the link to that at some point. I'm not seeing any questions, so thank you to everyone for attending. And, oh, we see one from Terry Goodtrack here. How would community values influence the vision?
Yeah, Terry, could you bring Terry on? I'd love to have him talk. I know he's talked about that a little bit.
Let's see here.
It'd be great to, Terry is the CEO and president of AFOA Canada.
Okay, so I've hit allow to talk.
Terry, I'll get you to speak to your own question.
Well, I think, I think what you have to do is through the community-based planning process, so you have to have that discussion is what are the key community values that are important to the community, right? Some of them are very generally the same by community, but some are very specific to the community. And that's what influences, to me, not only the operation of the First Nation government, but also the choices in economic development opportunities. So it's important, I think, to have that discussion up front on what are some of these key values and beliefs. Like as an example is you could have we always talk about 7 generations thinking, but are there other key beliefs that the community sort of wants to ensure that's on the table? Yeah. Like, do we believe in the notion that you only take what you need. You only take what you need. So that would influence an economic development opportunity, right? As if that's all you're doing, if that's what you really believe, is you're not overly harvesting or overly producing on an economic development opportunity.
Yeah, and I think the specific example is very helpful there, Terry. Essentially, when you do look at those vision statements, even the ones we shared from Akuzasti, they are largely value driven, right? Um, but but sometimes it's easy not to see them like that. So rights protection, that's value driven. Quality of life, that's value driven. So you do, it is in there because in some respect, what they're trying to say is we'd like to return to some values, or we'd like to make sure that we arrive in a community that is able to where we're able to live a different life and have a different experience. So that's kind of what I think we get there. Okay. We probably should wrap up though, Terry and Spencer, because we do have one more.
Okay, so thank you for everyone for attending, and thanks to you, Harold and Terry, and we'll see you at the next webinar if you're joining, and if not, this webinar is officially over, so thank you for joining.
Everybody take care.